Well, I'm originally from St. Paul, Minnesota, but I've been down here a very long time and had my career at the university. We have these brochures, Discover History in the Old City Cemetery, and it has a map inside of most of the important burials. So if you want one, feel free to take one. They're free. And fortunately, the cemetery is real close by, so we won't have a big hike to get over there. And why don't we just follow along with me then? Oh, any questions, first of all? Anything? We'll certainly have time for questions when we get over there. Thank you. There were cemeteries in Brownsville prior to this one. For example, down by Fort Brown, where the college is, Texas Southmost College, there's a peninsula area there, and that peninsula across the Resaca from the old fort buildings was a military cemetery until period 1909 and 1911, when they thought they were going to be shutting the fort down. And so they removed all the remains from the military cemetery and took them over to a place in Louisiana. So that was one early cemetery. And then there was one down by the Cameron County Courthouse here in Brownsville. Behind the Cameron County Courthouse, about 10, maybe 12 years ago, they were going to restore that courthouse. And when it came to locating the chillers for the air conditioning, they were going to locate them back behind the courthouse. They started digging and they found remains, human remains there. And so that area's been preserved, and they've got a kind of a fence around it and so on, although I don't think they encompass the whole area. But that was from the early 1850s, about 1853. They were using that as a cemetery up until perhaps as late as 1868. And 1868 is when this one officially opened, although there are burials that had already occurred here. They couldn't really bury a lot of people because there were some kind of watery bogs in this area that presented a kind of a challenge. Improvements, let me back up. 1853 is when they also tried to start this cemetery, but they really didn't get anywhere until about 1858. That's when they began to make improvements out here, a road and a map and so on, that they could actually use it. The wall around the cemetery, the city did, I kind of hate to get into this, but I should mention that we're the poorest community in the United States, in case anybody doesn't know that already. There's almost some kind of sense of bizarre pride in being number one in something, you know. But that's one of the reasons we don't have money for stuff. They didn't have money to put up a wall, so they got the Masons, the Masonic order locally, which has been here since 1850 and is now in the first Cameron County Courthouse, is now owned by the Masons for over a century. Anyway, the Masons back in the 19th century were the people that were important and had some money, so they put up money for the wall. And the Catholic Church and the International Order of Odd Fellows. So those three groups got their own sections in the cemetery, and I'll show you that as we go along.
Who were the Odd Fellows?
Pardon?
What was
just a kind of a social group that had their own insurance and that kind of thing. I'll show you another group too like that. These have all kind of faded away now, but they were important at various times for socializing largely. Okay, the sexton recorded the burials here, so we do have a record of them. Mary Sloss was the sexton or the recorder for many years, lived across the street from the cemetery. And let's see if there's anything else I need to show you right now.
Where are those records at now?
Yeah, you know, that's a very good question. The city secretary is supposed to hold those records.
The Brownsville City Secretary?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And if they don't have it, I would check back with the people at where the museum we just came from. We had some, oh, I know who, at the Brownsville Heritage Museum downtown, Dave Parsons. He's the front desk guy.
Stillman House?
Yeah, next to the Stillman House. Dave Parsons. He knows all that stuff about where those records are, and because he was doing a lot of work with them. So check with him. Okay, let's see what we've got here. Jose San Roman, very important fellow. You know, I'm glad they put these up for people who just wander in here, but also I kind of hate them when I'm doing a tour because people start looking at and reading. Jose San Roman was from Spain. He was an entrepreneur, set up business downtown. On Elizabeth Street is the San Roman building, 1850. So he was here just in the very earliest years of Brownsville. Brownsville didn't come into existence until after the war between the United States and Mexico, back in 1846 to 48. And when the river was established as the official boundary, then Brownsville came into existence to help support Fort Brown and to trade with Matamoros. And I can't resist telling you about a little bit on Matamoros, which first began to come into existence at the time of the American Revolution. I think that's kind of impressive. And we have a historical presence here that goes back to the same time of the American Revolution. Well, let's see what else.
I guess we're in the street here.
Oh, somebody coming through. Well, not very often. Okay, let's go over here. Every war, from the War of 1812 until now, has a veteran buried in this cemetery. Here's Henry Kingsbury, Sergeant Infantry, World War I. This is probably the most prominent, what would you call it, tomb in the cemetery. It's the Pedro Boyce tomb, but the important thing for us is it was the architect for it was a man named Heinrich Portscheller, and he was responsible. If you've ever been up to Roma, they have a number of impressive buildings, 19th century buildings there in Roma, around the plaza there and the church and so on, and Portscheller did a number of those buildings, so he's a highly regarded 19th century architect. The Boyce family was around until, and may still be around. I remember a friend of mine with a police department said that one of the Boyce men was a motorcycle cop here in Brownsville for a number of years. Oh. Don't let me run by this. Let me make sure I've got I haven't done this for a while. This is the Sociedad Benito Juarez. This is a what's the term for it? A mutualista. organization. Starting about late 1860s and running up until, well, probably not, maybe 30 years ago, you had these Mexican-American organizations of mutual aid. That's why you have the term mutualista. And they were organizations, but they also provided help to each other and insurance and so on. And one of the parts of the deal was that if you were in the Sociedad Benito Juarez, you had a burial place. And this is the burial place for that particular organization. There's another Sociedad Miguel Hidalgo in another portion of the cemetery we'll see. And supposedly there's a third, although I've never encountered that one. Miguel Hidalgo was the father of independence for Mexico, and Benito Juarez is one of the heroes of Mexico, so I'm not surprised that they're the names. You go to a plaza in a Mexican city, you're going to find a bust or statue of Benito Juarez and one of Miguel Hidalgo. So. Notice another feature here that you don't see in a lot of cemeteries up north, and here's a photo of a wedding photo of a family right there that will appear in some of the tombstones. Not many here, not many, but sometimes. You may have heard of the King Ranch. There's another big one up there called the Kennedy Ranch, founded by a man named Mifflin Kennedy. Well, this was the Kennedy family burial plot. But back in 1917, they established a new cemetery, Buena Vista Cemetery, another part of town, and it became fashionable to have your family buried there rather than here. And so the remains of the Kennedy family were dug up and taken over to Buena Vista, except for Adrian Vidal, who was a stepson of Mifflin Kennedy. But Adrian got involved during the Civil War era. First he was with the Union, then he left and joined the Confederacy, and then he left that and went over to Mexico and got involved with the Juan Cortina group. And then finally, ultimately, to shorten the story, he got caught by the Imperialista forces of Maximilian and was executed. All that happened, he was an officer, he was only 20 years old when they executed him. That's the way things went back at that time, but apparently he was kind of an embarrassment to the family, so they left him. One of the Kennedy daughters married Frederick Stark, and I think this was the mother here. I don't know where Frederick is, but he's behind there. Yeah, there it is, Frederick Stark. And they had a couple children. There's one of them, Charles William Stark. He didn't live real long either, did he? This is Daisy. Poor Daisy was only 4 to 5 years old when she ran out in the street at some kind of parade or something and was the first person killed in a vehicle accident. A horse-drawn carriage or something hit her and she was killed. And there are people who still believe that there's some kind of presence here, and hence the toys, all these little things here in remembrance of Daisy. You see the flower kind of bent over, one flower bent over there. This is a German one. We have people from all over the world here. Here's a German, born in Hamburg, Germany, for example. Here's a Confederate. We have a number of Confederate burials here as well as Union. So there's Confederate War era. Samuel Brooks, buried here, was a very prominent architect in Brownsville. A number of buildings, important, prominent buildings were built by him. I don't know if the grammar school, the old Cameron County Courthouse. His home has been moved a couple of times, but it's down on St. Charles Street today. I have to keep an eye on this. Oops, pardon me. I don't know that. Yeah, you can see that blue tomb right there. Werbisky was the name of the family there, and one of the Werbiskys. Just remember that name. I'm going to bring it up to you again when we get to another place. But anyway, that's where Werbisky is buried. You can see they've got an angel up on the top, and the head is missing because this cemetery was subject to violence at times. There was a period when the Pata gang was operating here back in the 70s and in the 80s, and they used it as their hangout, and they did a lot of destruction in here. And indeed, the place has been improved dramatically, even though there are some rather rough-looking edges to some of the stuff you see here. Let me see who else I want to show you. This is the tomb of Samuel and Felipe Cobb. If you were to read those stones in the back there, you'll notice that they died on the same day. They were brothers. Back in the late 19th century in Brownsville, and Laredo as well, for that matter, there were two political parties, the Reds and the Blues. And there was a lot of hostility and a lot of friction, despite the fact that neither one stood for anything other than our people against their people. And one of the elections, around 1890, let's see if I've got to read the date on it, 1898, the Cobb brothers switched sides, went to support the other party. It doesn't really matter which one. An opponent from the original party named Guillen was so outraged by that he killed the Cobb brothers. He murdered these two guys for switching parties. Well, Guillen was arrested and put in jail, but some of Cobb's relatives and friends, led by Mr. Werbisky, broke into the jail and fired guns through the bars of the cell and killed Guillen. So, violence. In Laredo, it was the Huaraches versus Las Botas. The huaraches presumably representing the poorer element, and thus botas representing los ricos. But same kind of thing. There really wasn't much difference between them. Anyway, those two political parties functioned well into the 20th century for a long time. Two political parties. So that's the story of the Cobb brothers.
Do you know who the Schwartz girl is? Or?
Nope, don't know anything about her. Notice she didn't live very long either.
She was born the year they died.
Yeah, but not directly associated with that. Right over here, if I can make this step. This is a veteran of the Battle of San Jacinto on the Mexican side. Rafael Morales, veteran of the Army, born Mexican, hero of the Battle of San Jacinto, son, etc., etc., etc. So very interesting, I think, to have a veteran of the Battle of San Jacinto, which would gain Texas its independence, but he was fighting for Santa Ana at that time. Isn't this an interesting place?
Are the large tombs just a matter of money?
Yeah. Yep. We're fortunate in a way that the drought has kept the weeds from springing up all over the place. This can get very weedy when it's been raining. Here's the first mayor of Brownsville, the first judge of Cameron County, Israel Bigelow. Brownsville was a place people came to oftentimes. I don't know if you've ever heard the GTT, Gone to Texas. People would pull up stakes and leave and come to Texas before as well as after the Revolution for Independence, because it was a place you could start again. You know, that if there were scandals in your background, like Sam Houston, for example, you could get away from that. Well, Brownsville was much the same way. Israel Bigelow was, I don't remember if there were any particular scandals regarding him, but I do remember in a book written from letters that the wife of the first quartermaster at Fort Brown came down here 1847 or 48. She lived in Brownsville for a while when it was first founded. She described one event, a rough and tumble affair on the main street of Brownsville between our mayor and a member of the learned profession, which is another lawyer, rolling around in the dirt. You know, this was the mayor of Brownsville and some local lawyer just hitting each other, fighting it out on the main street of Brownsville. Because Brownsville was a rough and tumble frontier town in the early days when this cemetery first got going. Let's see what else we can find here. Just a minute. I have to look a little bit sometimes. Check out where Yep, right back here. As best you can make it. This was the family plot for the McAllens. We've heard probably of John McAllen. Well, that's who McAllen is named for. And this is where his I even have a photo somewhere of his the day they buried him here. And his wife, Salome Bailly McAllen, born in Matamoros, August 1830, died Brownsville, 1898. But with few exceptions, none of these people are here anymore. They got moved over to the Buena Vista. I don't know what that one says for that matter. If there's, don't know. Henry Miller. Henry Miller was the guy who ran the hotel in Brownsville. He built a big hotel early, lasted into the 20th century. We're right down on Elizabeth Street. So I can tell you that much about him. There's another one I'm looking for here. Notice the peculiar positioning of this particular tomb. These graves don't go back that far, only to the 1980s. Missionaries, Baptist missionaries to Mexico, and they're being recognized. This one, Reverend David C. Creve, died 1866. So did this one. Were they in some way murdered? Oh, we have no way of knowing. But 1866, that's during the Civil War going on in Mexico between the Juaristas and the Imperialistas, Maximilian versus Juarez, so it's very possible they got executed, but I don't know the full story on them. Now here's another Civil War burial of a veteran from the Civil War. This died in 1867, Lieutenant Colonel in the regiment of U.S. Colored Troops. So he was a commander of the black soldiers during the Civil War, George Dennett. The Reverend Hiram Chamberlain was the father of Henrietta Chamberlain, who married Richard King. And when King died, well, King, you know, was the founder of the King Ranch. But when he died, his wife, Henrietta, took over and she ran the place for quite a few years. She was ran the ranch. Anyway, he was buried here. The father, her father, he was a missionary down here, Presbyterian, I think. Yeah. I remember a woman that was kind of looked after the cemetery for a number of years told me that this began to look pretty shabby at one point, and so she went up to the King Ranch headquarters and said, hey, Richard King's father-in-law's tomb looks pretty shabby, better do something about it, and they did. They fixed it all up. Here's a couple more rather prominent burials. One, the one they put the sign up for, Sheriff Santiago Brito, he captured the people who were guilty of a train robbery and got killed for it. Somebody assassinated him. We don't know who. So, over here, another attempted killing. This is Marshal, actually police lieutenant at one point, Ignacio Dominguez. his father was head of the Mexican Spy Company, which was a company of Mexicans during the war with Mexico that the Union hired to protect supply lines and stop murdering from going on. Well, anyway, when the war was over, he had to get out of Mexico and came up here, and this was his son. Son became a police lieutenant, and then during the Brownsville raid, which happened in 1906, there were black soldiers stationed here in Brownsville, and there was some animosity. And one night, a bunch of people stormed through the streets shooting, and this police lieutenant got shot. His horse was shot out from under him and killed, and he was wounded in his arm. He lost his arm as a result of that. There's still a big controversy about, was it the black soldiers shooting, or was it people trying to make it look like they were shooting? We don't know. But he lived on till 1927, despite loss of the arm. I think here's another Civil War veteran right behind us here. Yeah, Emmett Goodridge, Sergeant, Wisconsin Cavalry, Civil War. You'll notice these cement posts with a groove in them. That was to support what amounted to an anchor chain that went all around this section that belonged to the Masons. All the way along here, up along here. Henry Maltby, wife of Henry Maltby, he's here somewhere too. H.A.M. probably. He was a newspaper man. He had his own newspaper here in Brownsville for a while. Later on moved up to Corpus. You can see he had a daughter named Texas Bird. Only lived a very short time.
Why is there water in there?
That's a good question. Oh, this faucet, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they need to tighten that up.
Explains it.
J.J. Koch was a prominent Brownsvillian. He was in the Civil War, another Confederate, as I recall. Victor Sabri. This is kind of an interesting story. I was just checking on it last night. He got involved in the Rio Grande City riots of 1888. Somebody got arrested and supposedly tried to break out of jail, and Sabri shot him. Sabri was a customs inspector at that time. He had been a Texas Ranger, so you can say that we had at least one Ranger that's buried here as well. And he also took a shot at Catarino Garza. Catarino Garza was kind of a famous revolutionary who tried to overthrow Porfirio Diaz, the longtime dictator of Mexico. He didn't succeed, but he operated here along the border for a while, trying to stir up opposition to Porfirio Diaz. And Victor Sabri got crosswise with him, and there was a little shooting that took place, although Garza was not mortally wounded, obviously.
Did the families plant the trees, or?
Some of them were originals here, and I don't recall any specific items that were mentioned as such.
There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason in terms of the variety or location.
No, they were here.
The orange tree.
This is where the Masonic Lodge entrance is, obviously. And over here on this side is the Odd Fellows. And over on this side was the Catholic portion, although the Catholics did not use it exclusively. Look at the tree stumps. Those are the Woodmen of the World memorials. This is an organization, a fraternal organization. If you belonged to it, paid your dues, you were entitled to a burial place and a tree stump-like tombstone. And in older cemeteries, you still see a lot of those today. Look, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 right here. And there are a few others scattered around too. Woodmen of the World. Yeah, they're around. They're all around here. Another one over there. Another one there. One of the famous early Brownsville entrepreneurs, Francisco Iturria. He was a protege of Charles Stillman, the founder of Brownsville. His father had been a Spanish officer, I think. At any rate, after the Mexican-American War, Francisco came over to the U.S. side and worked for Stillman a little bit and worked on his own account, began to buy some land, and he became enormously wealthy. His business is still down there. You can see it on Elizabeth Street near the bridge. He had a safe, a big safe, that made him the banker. The guy that has a safe, he gets to be banker. And he would sit in his front part of his shop and trade Mexican silver pesos for dollars back and forth, kind of an exchange house. Anyway, he bought a lot of land, became enormously wealthy. One of his descendants, Frank Iturria, just died about a year or two ago. And he had a big ranch. I remember driving out to his ranch house. It was from the highway, it was 10 miles across his property just to get to his ranch house. And he had all kinds of oil stuff going on there, and so the money just kept reproducing itself. And that was just one of the ranches. Then his another son, another great-great-grandson, and his sister, they owned another big ranch up towards where the King Ranch is. But another case where the family removed the remains and took it over to Buena Vista. But we had him first. Oh, yeah, William Neal. Yeah, 1807 to 1896. Yeah, William Neal. As an Englishman, he came over. I think they built a ship that was to be used as a naval vessel, either against the Mexicans or for the Mexicans. Anyway, somehow he came over with it, wound up here in Mexico, and eventually went back briefly to England, married a woman, came back here, and wound up in Matamoros. And this is all before there was any Brownsville. And he opened a stagecoach line out to what is now Port Isabel area, and built a house on this side, which still exists, and we're trying to get it relocated so we can fix it up.
Where in Port Isabel?
That's a very good question, because in the early years there wasn't even really a port there. There was a place called Brazos de Santiago, and so he was connected to that area. That's the best I can do on it, before they really set up the port in Port Isabel. He lived on a long time. He was mayor of Brownsville at one point. he was in the Civil War, as you see over there. Second lieutenant, etc., Confederate States Army. Not surprising at all. And Juan Cortina was a famous controversial figure who raided Brownsville. I'm giving you the very short version here. And according to the story, he shot in one of the Cortinistas, shot into the window of William Neal's home, mortally wounding Neal's son. But Neal's son lived long enough to get his baby son out of the building and away. So the family continued despite the death of William Neal's son. So William Neal the First had to raise the kid, but the family continued on here. And there's a woman that I didn't know her personally, but she was around and involved locally, Florence Neal Andalone. So the family was influential here for a long, long time. I think this is the one that is always a little troubling to me. Memory of Mary Alice Sharkey, who died of yellow fever here in Brownsville, 1858, age 4 years, 4 months, and 10 days. Requiescat in pace. Lot of yellow fever deaths here in Brownsville. 1853, it prompted the start of the cemetery. 1858, it prompted the let's get serious about it with the cemetery. So, you know, very troubling. Let me make sure I don't run away with this. Remember I told you that we had some people involved in scandals that came here to start again. Well, Rice Garland is a good example of that. He was born in Louisiana, became a congressman, U.S. congressman. He was appointed to the Supreme Court of Louisiana at one point. But while he was up in Washington, D.C. as a congressman, I guess, he got involved with a woman other than his wife, and had a couple kids by that second woman, as I recall correctly. Anyway, the scandal, and he was charged with forging some document, which as a lawyer you're not supposed to do, you know. Anyway, he came down here and started over, had a legal business here, and first in Matamoros, then, you know, on both sides, and eventually 1863 died down here. This tombstone had practically disappeared when that woman I mentioned to you earlier was trying to keep up with things, poking around with a rod, discovered it, and contacted the family, both families of Rice Garland, and they provided money and got it restored, and they came down here when it was all restored and put into place. And both families, both the first and second wives, worked on the genealogy of Rice Garland. Just never know what you're going to run into. There's another one I'm looking for here. Let me see if I can find it. This is the one. Yeah, this is the one. Notice when he died, 1849. So he wasn't buried here at first, was he? Because they haven't even started on this. He was buried over in that old cemetery behind the courthouse. And they must have dug him up and brought him over here later on. Another German, 1849. This guy attempted to set up a rival town when they were trying to decide where there would be a town after the U.S.-Mexican War. That he founded Shannondale, which didn't survive. You don't have to all come back, but Frank Natos was a bartender in I think it was the Ruby Saloon downtown the night of the Brownsville raid. Remember that issue about black soldiers, whether or not they were shooting up the town? Well, he's the only one that got killed. He was bartender, stepped outside and lit a cigarette, and boom, he was shot, dead. Here is what's believed to be our War of 1812 veteran, John Roach Butler, who was in a naval vessel as a very young man in the War of 1812. We believe. It's, tying these things down exactly from the War of 1812 is a little tricky, but it's generally believed that's the case. Here's Stephen Powers, captain of volunteers with Zachary Taylor's army at Matamoros during the war between the United States and Mexico. Settled here in Brownsville. Founder of one of the political parties here. Two years ago, my wife and I wrote an article about this guy, Joseph Kleiber. He was the first druggist, really, in Brownsville. Took over a drugstore that he was the first one, really, that could handle it. And this was at the time of just before the Civil War, around 1855. And when the Civil War came, he was on the Confederate side and had to leave sometimes, go over and stay out in Matamoros for a while, because when the Union took over the town, and then when the Union was thrown out, then he could go back. And he was also in charge of the post office for a time. And after the war, he was the one largely responsible for the first railroad into Brownsville from Port Isabel. Narrow gauge railroad, and if you haven't seen it when you get back to the museum, the engine from that train, one of the engines, is in the little separate room there at the museum out back. I don't know that we have to go all the way over there. You see that arch over there? That's the entrance to the Sociedad Miguel Hidalgo. That's the other Mutualista plot, where members of the Sociedad Miguel Hidalgo could be buried for free because they had paid their dues and they were members. Captain William Kelly, Lieutenant 8th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops, Civil War. He operated the last steamboat on the Rio Grande, the Bessie. There was a big steamboat business right after the war between the U.S. and Mexico. A lot of business, but by the early 20th century, it was gone. He was also the chairman of the school board here. It was responsible for building the first real school in Brownsville, the old grammar school on Washington Park. See that headless statue there? That's the statue of Angel, obviously, for Michael Schatz, S-C-H-O-D-T. According to the story, he gathered with friends every night down on Elizabeth Street at Jagu's Saloon, and one night when they were leaving, he walked down the street and somebody shot him to death, and they don't know who did it. Yeah, and it should be there too, McManus.
Okay.
Should be out here.
I don't really see it.
Yeah, 26, see what we got. No, they don't have it on here, it looks like. No. Nope. They should put it on there. Anyway, I'll tell you about it, because he's buried here, somewhere in this vicinity. Dr. McManus was a surgeon with Zachary Taylor's army when they came down here in the beginning of the war between the U.S. and Mexico. After the war, he had a house built on the plaza in Matamoros. And so he played an important social role in the Matamoros-Brownsville relationship for many decades. And perhaps the most unique feature about him is that he had one of the death masks of Napoleon. They made apparently 3 death masks when Napoleon died, and somehow McManus got a hold of one of them. And I've seen it many times, his tombstone. I just never exactly sure where it is. Yeah, I usually manage to find it though. This is a guy who was a major player in that first railroad, Jose Celaya, another Spanish immigrant. Right over here you can see one of the most important figures in Brownsville's political history, James B. Wells. Up a level or two in counties here in South Texas is a county called Jim Wells County. It's named after this guy. He was known as the first boss of Brownsville. Late 19th century, most major cities in the United States had a boss, somebody who was so politically powerful that he controlled everything. Well, Jim Wells was the boss in Brownsville from 1890 up to certainly 1920. Well, roughly. He was able to manipulate voters. He would get support from the ranchers and the businessmen by keeping things under control. And he got the support from the local Mexican-American community by handouts. He would give people money. Somebody needed, their father died, they needed money, he'd give them money. And so people were grateful to the patron, because that's how he liked to be thought of. But, of course, he was corrupt. So, not an unusual phenomenon, but somebody who played a big role here in Brownsville, helped bring the railroad to Brownsville. This is often considered perhaps the finest piece of art, other than that Boyce tomb, but finest statue here in the cemetery, belonging to the Andres Cueto family. Andres Cueto was a Spaniard who came over here with his family and established a business, commercial business downtown Brownsville. And on the first floor, its building's still there, he called it La Nueva Libertad, but it's commonly known as the Cueto building. And on the first floor, that's where they conducted business. On the second floor, that's where the family lived. And so he, as well as other Spaniards, were very influential in Brownsville in the early days. You'll notice this wall is kind of sloping this way. And that cross used to be standing up there, kind of leaning against the wall. So my question was the Christian cross holding up the wall of this Hebrew cemetery, or was the Hebrew cemetery holding up the Christian cross? Well, you can see ultimately the result. On the other side is the Hebrew cemetery.
I saw that.
And notice how much neater it is. That's because they have somebody who's responsible for it all the time. At least one Brownsville mayor, Benjamin Kowalski, is buried there. I think Reuben Edelstein, who was mayor in the 70s in Brownsville, I think he's buried there too. You'll notice no flowers. They don't have flowers in Hebrew cemetery. What they do sometimes is put stones on top of their tombs.
And the public go in there?
Well, they don't mind having people come in, but they keep it locked.
Oh, okay.
So when it's open, they certainly have people come in. And they keep keep it up, even though the congregation is diminishing in numbers. Here where we have the downward slope of the cemetery, this was known as Potter's Field. This is where poor people, indigents, were buried without markers for a long time. It's estimated that decades ago there were already 30,000 people buried here in this cemetery. So a lot of people. And back when they had Hurricane Beulah in the late 1960s, I should say, hurricane, all that water unearthed some of the remains, and there were some coffins floating around in the Resaca out there. I suppose that notion would unnerve people enough that across the way, you know, it's nice to have a home on a Resaca, but I guess maybe you might feel uncomfortable with a cemetery on the other side, or at least some people might.
Spirits.
Any questions?
Are there any ghosts?
We conduct haunted tours in October. You know,
Here?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Has anybody seen anything?
Well, it's all a matter of opinion.
Well, I heard that at nighttime, not even the Brownsville Police Department comes in here because they're afraid that it's haunted and there's demons and all.
Well, there are people that certainly feel uncomfortable and have encountered what they believe are phenomena. I'm a bit of a skeptic myself, but
Me too, but I want to experience it myself.
you're right.
She won't come with me, but
No.
I'd like to come.
Well, you can always get a new husband. One more little story. Pancho Villa. He was never here in the valley, but one of his armies was. Under Jose Rodriguez, I think was the name of the commander. They attacked Matamoros, which was occupied by the Carrancistas, the federal force, unsuccessfully. And a number of them, well, after the Carrancistas turned their machine gun loose on them, fled to this side. Many of them wounded, and quite a few died. Those that survived, at least long enough to be treated, were treated in a building in downtown Brownsville by local doctors, but a number of them did die. And we know the names of at least 6 of them. We think at least a dozen are buried out here, Villistas, in other words, members of Pancho Villa's army. Okay. Now, the brochure gives you a slightly different tour than what I just gave you. I gave you the Knopp tour, which is very similar but not identical, and they have some places that they might show you things that you can read about. I showed you things that aren't in there.
Do your haunted tours take place here, like in the cemeteries, or in Fort Brown?
Well, both.
Both?
Yeah, we have haunted tours downtown, at Fort Brown, and at the cemetery.
Okay.
Yeah, there's that McManus one I couldn't seem to find. Born 1824, died in Matamoros 1906. Assistant surgeon to the Andrew Jackson Regiment in the Taylor's Army in the U.S.-Mexico War.
Sir, do you have anything on someone named 1B Alamia?
Yes, there is an Alamia thing somewhere. Let's see if it's in.
Back over here. But the reason I'm asking is,
What do I know about him?
yeah, that's my great-grandfather.
Ah, yes.
Dave told me that he was buried here, but they moved his remains to Hidalgo. He wasn't sure about that. And
I wouldn't be entirely surprised.
No.
Because the Alamias are kind of influential Upper Valley.
yeah, okay, yeah, Hidalgo
But-
area.
But I don't remember anything particularly about
I know
him.
Lorenzo is over there in the family plot. And that's where Dave told me that's where Juan was at too, but that his remains had been moved. I was wondering
That much I couldn't help you with, but I might know a little bit more about the Alamias if you email me.
Okay.
I think I remember reading something about him.
Yeah, he was the one that was hanged by Blanco in Rio Bravo. Kind of, he was there.
There you go.
Full of horses.
Yeah. Yes.
What he didn't do what Blanco wanted him to do, he killed him.
Yeah, Lucio Blanco.
Yes.
Well, you already know that story then.
Well, I
So
did research on it.
that's about all I know about him. Well, we had a kind of a nice day for this. It's a little warm, but I remember the first time I saw this cemetery, or went into it rather, with this woman who kind of taking care of things, and it was drizzling and overcast and eerie, and it was the perfect weather to see the cemetery.
I know next week is going to be raining.
Pardon?
Next week is going to be raining.
Yeah, so I understand.
There's going to be another tour.
In October, you have the haunted one.
Yeah, we have haunted tours middle to late part of October at Fort Brown, in downtown, and here at the cemetery.
Big time or night time?
Nighttime.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
We start out in late afternoon when the sun goes down.
I went to school at Sam Houston State,
Oh yeah.
and the fraternities take the pledges to the prisoner cemetery.
Of course they do.
There's a filled-in well that's there. It's only like 2 feet deep, but at dark it looks like a well. And
They put 'em in there.
They make you jump in from the ledge. So you'll jump in the well.
Typical college fraternity hijinks. Yeah. Well, as you can see, there's a lot of history here at our cemetery.
Are there still programs for high schoolers to start taking college courses?
Yes, they have them at almost all of the high schools here. Are called early college high schools because they offer dual enrollment courses.
You would if you're homeschooled?
I don't know. I just don't know.
If you're a freshman, Bex is really good. I heard it's really intense, but
Brownsville Early College High School.
Oh, okay.
It's
when you graduate, you're supposed to graduate with your high school diploma.
and your yep.
Ideas are nice, but I mean, the workload, like every teacher is told to give at least 3 to 4 hours of homework every night.
Oh.
Yeah, so they're
My cousin's an elementary teacher, right? I don't know much about it.
yeah. I think only by the junior year they're able to do dual enrollment and AP, but they're kind of forced. So yeah.
I got one more thing to tell you. This is the Gavito tomb here. And Joe Gavito told me, and I guess I should have known, this is one of those ones where, you know, they open it and the remains that are already in there, the coffins that will have collapsed, so then they push another one in. See, so they'll have, I think he said there were up to 13 burials in the family tomb. Some of them you can walk down in there and they put them on the side, you know. But some of them, I remember my wife's grandmother passed away, and at the main cemetery over in Matamoros, that's where she went, into the family coffin or whatever you want to, not coffin, but tomb, and they just put the latest one in.
My mother says the only, because she's with the school district, she says the only thing about Florida is that they don't have much funds, so they don't have like good textbooks or
It's over at the college campus.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it's like next to the rec center, so it's kind of like hidden, but it's, you can look for the gym across from TRCC, and you just follow on that road into the rec center, and that's easy to get that. And it seems to be Brownsville early college. I remember I was trying to get in there at, I think, junior year, and that was
Come on.
Is there more inside that we're going to do, sir? Or is this...
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for coming along.
Thank you.
I was gonna ask for just regular days at the museum, like, do they charge or how much do they charge to just go in, look around?
I think you better come in for a second.
Okay.
Since I'm a life member, I don't pay anymore, so I don't remember.
Because I've been living here since I was born, but like I don't know why. I've just never heard of anything that Brownsville has to offer, like the art museum or the historic museum. But I'm a huge lover of history
Well, this is the place to come then.
and cemeteries.
How much is admission here? Student?
$2.
$2 for students.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
You should also consider maybe signing up for a membership for students that believe that
Oh, and what is the
maybe was that book. So you get a subscription to our newsletter.
Oh, Jesus.
All that. So every month we'll send out a newsletter and a calendar of events. If you also put your email down, we'll give you updates of different events and exhibits that are coming out at the museum. You'll get to events like walking, for example.
It's gonna be busy.